Hey everyone, and welcome to this study. Today, we're going to completely reconstruct a massive chunk of history that, frankly, you probably think you already know. But as it turns out, the physical evidence on the ground tells a very different and honestly a far more fascinating story than what we've all been taught in school. We're presenting a full summary of some incredibly compelling source material today. This comes from a fascinating presentation by an Islamic researcher named Thomas, and his research was recently featured on the brilliant YouTube channel Events and History. By the way, the link to that original, highly insightful source material is right below this video, and I highly recommend you check it out after we wrap up here. So together, we're going to unpack a major historical mystery. How exactly could we have gotten such a massive piece of European and Islamic history so wrong for so incredibly long? We're going to explore this massive paradigm shift regarding the 8th century Umayyad takeover of Spain, that famous entry into Andalusia. We're going to see that it was absolutely not a swift, unstoppable military sweep by a unified empire. Instead, as we impartially follow the historical evidence, we discover something much more complex. A slow, calculated, alliance-driven intervention right into the middle of a relentlessly bloody civil war.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our clear roadmap for how we're going to systematically reconstruct this historical narrative today. First, we'll look at the standard conquest myth. Second, a fractured Visigothic kingdom. Third, the anti-Trinitarian connection. Fourth, how auxiliaries turned into conquerors. And finally, we'll wrap up by reassessing the historical evidence.
Starting right off with Section 1, the standard conquest myth. And this brilliantly illustrates the core of the issue we're tackling today. For centuries, the widely accepted historical narrative, literally the exact story printed in history textbooks and taught in seminaries around the world, has painted a very specific, highly dramatic picture of the Muslim entry into Spain. The standard story goes that it was a rapid, utterly unstoppable military sweep. We're conditioned to envision this united Islamic empire, fueled by intense religious fervor, bursting out of the Middle East, surging across the entirety of North Africa, and then crashing into the European continent like a tidal wave, easily overwhelming a united Christian nation. It's almost always presented as a story of absolute, sudden conquest happening during the early, explosive periods of Islamic expansion. They usually date this roughly between 634 and 656 AD. But the actual historical data and the archaeological evidence that Thomas presents completely shatters this assumed timeline. Based on the official ground truth, this takeover actually happened decades later. We're talking strictly from 711 to 718 AD. That is a timeline shift of nearly an entire century. Now you might be wondering, so what? Why does a date change matter? Well, because a nearly 100-year shift completely alters the entire political landscape and the mechanics of how this event actually unfolded. It proves beyond a doubt that this was not some rapid tidal wave military sweep from the ancient world. Instead, it was a slow, incredibly pedantic takeover driven heavily by political alliances, opportunistic maneuvering, and pre-existing civil wars.
Which brings us right into Section 2, a fractured Visigothic kingdom. To truly understand how this slow, methodical takeover happened, we need to completely erase the idea of a peaceful, united Christian Spain just sitting there waiting to be conquered by outsiders. Instead, I want you to imagine the absolute chaos of a nation that was constantly, viciously at war with itself. Long before the Umayyads ever set foot on the peninsula, it was ruled by the Visigoths, and their history is just wildly dramatic. Let's trace this out. They were initially an Eastern Germanic tribe. Around 300 AD, they converted to a very specific theology called Arianism. Now, under severe pressure from other migrating invaders, they were pushed into Roman territory, where they faced some pretty deep betrayals, and they eventually retaliated in a completely unimaginable way. In 410 AD, this roaming, displaced tribe actually managed to sack the city of Rome. It's this incredibly shocking moment in history. They completely upended the supposedly invincible Roman Empire, and they even plundered the sacred treasures of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem that the Romans themselves had previously stolen. Just wild stuff. Eventually, they roamed westward, and by about 500 AD, they had firmly settled and taken control of the Iberian Peninsula, which we know today as modern-day Spain. But the absolute catalyst for their eventual spectacular downfall happens right here at the very end of our timeline in 589 AD.
In 589 AD, the Visigothic king, a guy named Recared I, makes a massive, fateful political pivot. He officially converts to Catholicism. Now, he didn't necessarily do this out of some sudden religious awakening. He did it for sheer political legitimacy. He desperately wanted to gain the political and economic approval of the incredibly powerful Byzantine emperor. And as you might expect, to protect their own wealth and their own status, the high nobility of Spain quickly followed the king's lead. But the lower nobility? That was a totally different story. They were still fiercely, undeniably Arian. They fundamentally and violently rejected this new Catholic Byzantine theology. So the consequences of the king's political pivot were immediate, and they were absolutely catastrophic for the nation. The fiercely Arian lower nobility rebelled, plunging Spain into a vicious, continuous cycle of internal slaughter. Contemporaries at the time literally referred to this era as the Gothic disease. It wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a total breakdown of society. It was like a revolving door of violence. A new king would take the throne, he'd last maybe a few months, and then he'd get poisoned or stabbed by a rival faction. Another king would emerge, armies of cousins would march against one another, and this bloody, awful cycle would just repeat itself. This constant, generations-long civil war completely hollowed out their military strength and their political stability. It transformed Spain from a stronghold into a fractured, fragile state that was entirely vulnerable to anyone who might intervene.
Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds, the anti-Trinitarian connection.
While Spain was violently tearing itself apart over theology and royal bloodlines, we actually have to look across the water to North Africa to understand the deep theological glue that would eventually bind those rebellious Visigoths with the incoming forces from the east. You see, in the ancient world, theology was not just a weekend debate over coffee. It was a literal matter of life and death. It dictated your alliances, your trade partners, and your mortal enemies. The core of this cross-cultural connection is anti-Trinitarianism. Now, objectively speaking, this is a broad theological term for belief systems that fundamentally reject the mainstream concept of the Trinity. This powerful umbrella included Arianism, which, remember, is the exact religion held by the rebellious, embattled lower nobility Visigoths in Spain. They viewed Jesus as divine, sure, but created and strictly subordinate to God the Father. Interestingly enough, this very same anti-Trinitarian umbrella also covered the beliefs held by early Abadi tribes who were migrating across the North African coast at that exact same time. Both of these groups, despite their massive geographical and cultural differences, shared a profound fundamental rejection of the mainstream Catholic and Byzantine theology. And this shared belief, it was about to become an incredibly powerful unifying political tool.
So, you might be asking, how exactly did this specific theology spread all the way across the deserts of North Africa just to sit right on Spain's doorstep? Well, it's a fascinating story of migration and cultural influence. First, Ibadi merchants, acting as crucial military auxiliaries, began mixing with the Sassanid army during the massive, perilous wars happening over in the east. As those brutal wars eventually ground down and the armies retreated, many of these influential Ibadis made the strategic decision to just stay put, eventually settling down in North Africa. Because they were a highly successful, wealthy, and influential merchant group, they began interacting heavily with the indigenous tribal Berber societies in the region. Over just a few decades, specifically between 660 and 700 AD, they successfully introduced and spread their anti-Trinitarian religion to these Berber tribes. And here's why that matters. Because the Berbers operated as a strict, hierarchical tribal society, it created a massive domino effect. If you successfully converted the tribal leaders, the entire tribe would instantly follow suit. So suddenly, you have a massive, battle-hardened population in North Africa, unified by the exact same anti-Trinitarian theology as the rebellious Visigoth nobles, suffering right across the strait in Spain.
Section 4. Auxiliaries turn into conquerors.
Okay, this is the incredible climax of the story, where the two geographic threads we've been following finally collide. The entry into Spain absolutely did not start as a unified holy war of conquest. Believe it or not, it started as a simple transactional mercenary contract for a civil war. In the early 8th century, the southern Visigoth nobles, those anti-Trinitarian Arians we talked about, are actively losing their endless rebellion against the Catholic king in Spain. But crucially, these rebels still hold some remnant coastal territories just across the strait in North Africa. Using those North African territories as a staging ground, the desperate Visigoth rebels essentially send out an invitation. They hire Berber and Arab auxiliary troops to cross over the water to Spain and help them finally overthrow the Catholic king. And they chose those specific troops precisely because of their shared, unifying anti-Trinitarian theological connection. But here is the dramatic twist, the ultimate historical irony. The hired auxiliaries cross the strait, they fight, they successfully help destroy the Catholic king's forces, and then the dust settles. The mercenaries look around, they see that the Visigothic army is utterly decimated, the royal state is completely broken. And they, the hired guns, are suddenly standing there as the single strongest military force on the entire peninsula. The Visigoths had unwittingly handed their own country over to their help. This stunning realization brings us exactly to the critical window of 711 to 718 AD. Notice this is well into the 8th century, far, far past the era of rapid Middle Eastern expansion. It is during this specific, chaotic window that the Umayyad forces, under the command of their leader Musa, look at Spain and realize the door has essentially been left wide open for them. Musa realizes that the powerful Berber auxiliaries already stationed in Spain are technically his subjects, and they will naturally fall in line under his command. He doesn't need to launch a massive, costly, bloody holy war of invasion. He literally just needs to walk in. He systematically leverages the existing mercenary alliances and the absolute vacuum of political power left by the Visigothic Civil War to firmly establish his own dominance. It wasn't a blind conquest. It was a brilliant, highly calculated, opportunistic takeover of a state that had just self-destructed.
So the crucial point is perfectly summarized by one distinct, profound observation from the study's source material. Half the conquest was not a conquest at all, but was done through alliances. We really have to think about the fascinating psychology of the local Visigoth rulers at this exact moment in time. When the Umayyad leadership stepped in, many of these local Visigoth lords didn't even attempt to fight back. They didn't mount a heroic defense. Instead, they quickly switched sides. They eagerly signed strategic treaties. Why would they do that? Because after generations of suffering under the Gothic disease, these anti-Trinitarian lords genuinely realized they preferred the safety and theological alignment of living under foreign anti-Trinitarian Umayyad leaders rather than continuously bleeding their own families to submit to a local Catholic king. It was a massive, highly pragmatic realignment of theology and politics, and it completely smoothed the path for the Umayyad takeover.
Bringing us to Section 5, Reassessing the Historical Evidence.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we actually know all of this. Why should we challenge a narrative that has been confidently accepted for centuries? Well, we just have to look at the physical ground evidence, which tells a story that literally cannot be faked. If this era had truly been a massive, sweeping military conquest by a unified empire, the expected archaeological evidence would be horrifying. We would see violently razed cities. We'd find massive ash layers in the soil from burned foundations, mass graves, and violently plundered fields. But the actual documented ground evidence in Spain from this exact period shows extremely little archaeological destruction. It simply isn't there. Furthermore, if it was a swift, unified conquest, we would expect immediate, centralized control of the economy, right? If you're conquered by a massive empire, you are immediately forced to use their currency. But the evidence clearly shows that local Visigoth rulers were actively minting their own coins during this time. In the ancient world, stamping your local lord's face on a piece of silver is the ultimate undeniable flex of sovereign independence. It is the absolute smoking gun that heavily implies a fragmented civil war landscape, not unified submission to a new central conqueror. And finally, rather than mass populations abandoning their homes and fleeing into the mountains to escape an invading horde, the historical records show numerous strategic treaties and political concessions being casually made at the local level.
To provide a full summary of the massive paradigm shift uncovered in this study, we're really looking at 4 distinct historical realities regarding the Umayyad entry into Andalusia. First, this entire era of history appears to be driven deeply by theological alignment, anti-Trinitarians seeking out and aligning with other anti-Trinitarians rather than just sheer, aggressive territorial ambition. Second, the initial entry into the European continent was absolutely not a holy war of conquest. It was a desperately requested intervention into an ongoing, devastating civil war by hired auxiliaries. Third, lasting power was ultimately gained and solidified not just through the edge of a sword, but through pragmatic, mutually beneficial strategic treaties made at the local level. And fourth, the ultimate takeover occurred at a much slower, incredibly pedantic pace well into the early 8th century, completely challenging the idea of a lightning-fast sweep in the mid-7th century.
Which leaves us with this final, weighty thought to consider. When we literally dig into the soil, when we examine the locally minted coins, read the surviving treaties, and map out the deep theological divides, does the traditional, dramatically simplified conquest narrative still make any sense? Or is history, particularly the history conveniently written by the victors centuries later, always far more complicated than the stories we passively inherit? Examining the ground beneath our feet is often the absolute only way to uncover the truth hidden by convenient narratives. It is our job as focused learners to impartially follow that evidence wherever it leads. Thank you so much for joining me for this study today. If you want to dive deeper into the incredible historical and archaeological data Thomas presented, be absolutely sure to check out the link to the full events and history source material right below this video. Stay curious, keep examining the evidence, and I'll see you in the next one.